Hello, and welcome to Think About It. I'm Sylvia Henderson, your host, and I invite you to tune in, take what you see and hear, and, well, think about it. So today we're talking about retirement. Woohoo! Yeah. And my guest is Alex Seleznev, and he is the president of Capital Square Financial, and he's a financial planner specializing in retirement. So that's why I'm talking to him about retirement. Alex, thank you and welcome to Think About It.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Sylvia. It's great to be with you today.
So I ask every guest, what led you to specialize in retirement?
Well, absolutely. So I've been doing this work for a little over 16 years at this point. And what I started noticing is that as people get closer to their retirement, years, usually their late 50s, early 60s, their finances become much more complex. And it's very different when you're working with someone who's in the accumulation stage of their life. Usually they have certain needs, but they tend to be not that complex. Now, for someone who's transitioning or in retirement, there's so many different nuances that you really need to know about. So that's my specialty.
Okay, so I'm thinking my viewers are looking at you, and while we misjudge age, when you say 16 years ago, it's like, so what do you know about retirement? What makes you able to talk about it?
Well, I'll tell you, Sylvia, this is actually, personal to me. So, my father passed away, 3 years ago at this point, a little more than that, on November 25th of 2020. It was right before Thanksgiving, actually. And what's, I guess, interesting about it, he looked healthy. Everything was fine. He actually passed away after playing some tennis, that early morning. And that really made me rethink, what I do and in terms of the work with my clients, because see, there's this mantra of saving more, trying to work longer, delaying your retirement, work more, stay with us. People expect to live longer. There's that too. When in practice, things like that can happen, and that changes your perspective. So I thought, would be the next, step for me is to really work with people like that, like my father.
Wow.
So that's my story.
Oh, sorry to hear that. Those sudden things kind of prompt you to do things that you hadn't thought about doing for a long, long time. So when we spoke before the show, you mentioned that your practice is a holistic practice. So I'm thinking financial planner, I don't think about holistic stuff. What's a holistic practice for you?
Well, absolutely. And the idea behind it, at least the way I think about it, is to go beyond the numbers. I mean, the typical approach, send me the statements, I'm going to do the assessment, and I'll tell you what your number is. I mean, that's your common approach. Usually what I do, I start by asking, what are your goals and objectives? What are your values? How do you envision, your retirement? Or actually, I've been trying to change the way I talk about it. How do you envision the next chapter of your life? So usually have a conversation about it, and only then you start talking about the numbers. So to me, that's a much more comprehensive approach to planning.
Okay, because I would think a lot of those things do feed into retirement. And as I'm thinking about the term retirement, I know, since I've got gray hair, and I would have retired from corporate had I still been in corporate. Retirement looked in the 20th century different from what it looks like now. And I'm sure for our up and coming youth, it's going to look different for them in the future. How has that evolved and changed? And in fact, my parents, obviously, they retired differently from what I imagined.
Well, I mean, I'll start by saying that people tend to work longer now. And that's not necessarily for financial reasons. Many of them actually prefer to do that. They're expected to live longer. They want to remain productive for longer. They can help, their company or, their family, if that's any kind of family business. And that's what I've been seeing over the past decade or so. When people reach out to me, they tend to have a specific date in mind. But when you actually put together a plan for them and you start meeting, more often than not, they actually decide to disengage their employer, retire well beyond that original projected date. Not always, though, but in many cases, that's what happens.
Okay. And I'm thinking, my head is with corporate, because typically you're retiring from that job you had. I know young folks don't understand the 40-year career anymore, but typically you're retiring from an organization. And if I'm thinking about retirement, I remember I had an actual retirement counselor come into the company. I went to a financial planner for something else. So what triggers, I didn't think about that for retirement. So what triggers someone to call you? What are those triggers that say, ooh, we need to look for Alex?
Well, and it's interesting. It's almost like you made a couple of comments here. Just want to comment on the first one. I'll start by saying that perhaps 20, 30, maybe 40 years ago, it was very common for companies such as IBM as an example to have pension plans. So in some sense, there was no need to do much planning. The idea was, well, you have some savings, you're going to have your pension, then you're going to have your Social Security. So between those three, you should be fine once you retire. Well, that is no longer the case. Certainly has not been the case for the past, I'm going to say 20 years. I know for a fact that IBM actually transitioned to a regular 401k. So now, in some sense, you're on your own. You have to take care of your own finances. And if you're busy, if you're simply not willing to spend the time, or you don't have the knowledge, I'll just say that, well, then you seek someone like myself. Now, in terms of the trigger points, I will say this. The vast majority of my new clients, they don't just wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm going to go and see a financial planner. I wish that was the case. I very much wish that, but it's not. Usually there's a trigger point. Okay, inheritance would be one of them. The other one is, they get sick and tired of doing what they do. They've been doing it for the past 20, 30 years. When does it end? So in some sense, they're thinking about escaping into retirement. Sometimes, loss of a loved one. That's one of the triggers. So usually, again, there is something besides just saying, oh, let's do a regular review. So
I remember, again, because corporate life was different than it is now. I remember coming in early in my 20s in corporate, and fortunately I had a manager who said to me, find something to do beyond the company and start planning now. When you're in your 20s, you're thinking, yeah, right, I'm going to plan for, and 401k, no, I want to use that money for something else. But he said, start now. Because a lot of the folks that were retiring then turned up dead in 2 and 3 years because that was the way things were. So if people are watching, how young should they start planning for retirement?
That's a great question. So as early as possible. So, and I still do this webinars. I used to do more of it. So for young professionals specifically, my suggestion is to start saving as soon as you get your first job. At this point, again, I'll be blunt about it, there are no excuses. All you need is $25 a month. That's a perfect starting point, and perhaps, each month you can increase your savings, but there are no excuses at this point. It's so easy to do that. Now, I'll also say this in terms of, again, retirement planning, 7 to 10 years. That is that sweet spot for people to really focus on it. I'm not saying, again, you should wait to start thinking about it, 7 to 10 years before your projected retirement date, but usually that's the sweet spot, meaning, you already have a pretty good idea of where you are. Of course, you have some idea at least of your projected retirement date, and there's still enough time for someone like myself to really help you, successfully transition into the next chapter.
Okay, because I'm thinking 10 years maybe you can start, that compound interest thing starts kicking into your savings. There's still time to save something for retirement. Another thing you were mentioning when we were talking is we spend all of our early years saving. Or we should. Saving. I know I learned to do that. And when it's time to turn the switch and start spending, I know my parents were like, oh no, we can't spend. How do you get someone to flip that switch and realize that it's okay now to start enjoying what you saved.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Like your parents, it's a very common situation when people actually, it's relatively easy for them to save because they've been doing it their whole life and they're very successful. When the time comes to spend the money, it's challenging. So, I mean, I can think of two ways. Well, first of all, you need to make sure that they're comfortable. You need to make sure that they're comfortable, that they will not be running out of money, in retirement. In terms of my work, I usually, do those projections to age 95. So there's many years that will be covered. The second piece, which is, I would say, mostly practical, the idea is to really simulate a paycheck. So someone retires, it doesn't really matter at what age, and each month, presumably, or it can be done bi-monthly, they receive X dollars from their investment account. Oh. So it feels like a paycheck because the money simply comes in on a monthly basis. So that tends to make people more comfortable with the idea of, again, drawing from their accounts.
And is there an age at which that switch really needs to take place? I mean, I keep hearing about, and by the way, for our viewers, Alex is not giving financial advice.
Absolutely.
I forgot to say that at the beginning. Is there an age at which that switch has to take place? Like, I think required distribution and Social Security and all that stuff. I have to make decisions soon.
Sure. So, I mean, I'll say three things. In terms of your Social Security decisions, you need to make those between your age 62 and 70. Again, without going into too much detail, but 62 is the earliest and 70 is the latest. There's no benefit of waiting any longer. In terms of the required minimum distributions, it's 73, but there's a good possibility that over time that age will be increased. But again, for many people, these two numbers or dates, they're good to know. But in practice, their retirement will likely happen, sometime sooner or actually later than those two dates. So you really need to have a plan. That's the bottom line. You can't just say, okay, I'm not going to draw from my accounts until the age of 73, simply because that's the required minimum distribution age.
Okay.
So there needs to be a plan.
Okay. And I remember, before we take a break, I remember, again, being told, when you retire, you're going to spend only 70% of what you were spending now working. And I tell you, my friends right now, they're out cruising, they're out vacationing, and I'm thinking, I don't think 70% is going to get me there.
Sylvia, you're making such a good point. So first of all, I am not a big fan of this rules of thumb.
Okay.
I tend to use them occasionally, like in introductory meetings, because in practice, specifically for those who are thinking about retirement, it's really a three-stage process or period. So when people first retire, let's say late 60s, early 70s, I'm just making general observations here. Usually these are your go-go years. That's how I refer to it. That is when people start traveling more. That is where all of those plans essentially come to fruition and they start enjoying their golden years.
Okay.
Usually we're talking 10 to 15 years, depending of course on someone's health. What is important here, your spending during these years can be significantly higher, versus what someone, let's say, projected for your entire retirement.
I'm going to hold on. No, I'm going to hold on because this is perfect. This will make people come back to the second half of the program because you've got two more stages you have to talk about, all right? So we're going to need to take a break, and when we come back, you're going to learn about those other two stages and a lot more. So with that, we'll be back.
Women are bad with money.
It's what the world's been saying for centuries. But now,
we've got something to say.
Save it. Save the old-fashioned advice. The empty excuses. It's all worthless, unlike us.
To our fellow females, it is time to save ourselves by saving our money.
Contributing to our futures, investing in our independence.
Until we're no longer 80%
more likely than men to live in poverty in retirement.
So again, we say to that,
Save it. The falsehoods, the feelings of fault. Then the funds.
Learn how to save for your retirement at wesaysaveit.org.
Hello, welcome back to Think About It. I am still Sylvia Henderson, your host, and I'm still talking to Alex Seleznev about retirement. And we stopped with a cliffhanger at the break. And Alex was breaking down 3 stages that you address when you're working with people. So we hit stage 1. What are the other 2?
Yeah, so the other 2, again, the second one is your slow go years. And that is usually, I'm going to say, between your mid-70s, maybe to mid to late 80s, again, depending on your health.
Whoa, okay, that's old for slow go. I'm thinking that's the no.
You see, I'm trying to be conservative
Whoa,
here.
okay.
I'm trying to be, considerate. Again, it depends on each person and each family.
Okay.
But usually in terms of the stage of someone's life, people still travel, but perhaps not internationally. Perhaps they're not going to go for a 2 or 3 weeks long trip to Africa, as an example. They kind of stay local. At this stage in life, they tend to focus more on helping their family. At least that's my observation. So that multi-generational planning becomes important. But in terms of their spending, it usually actually goes down. So it does not go up as much. And then finally, the third stage, again, I'm going to say from mid-80s all the way to, let's say, late 90s or beyond, perhaps. These are your no-go years. Usually, and again, being trying to be gentle here, but usually that's when someone's health begins to decline. You start focusing more on medical expenses. Your budget essentially gets redirected toward care. So, and in some sense, in many cases, it actually begins to decline. The most important point here is, again, when you work with one number, it simply does not reflect the reality. You need to have a plan that addresses all 3 of those stages.
That's true. And I'm guessing that as you're working with people for those no-go years, I'll say, slow go years.
That's the second stage.
You're yes, spit it out. You're also being cautioned, or we're being cautioned about that end stage because, oh my gosh, long-term care, nursing home, and nursing care, and all of that comes into play. So we can't spend it all in the slow go years. I had to get that straight.
Well, it's interesting you asked me this question earlier in the first part, what triggers people to reach out to someone like myself. Long-term care expenses. I'm going to say that's the top 5, if not top 3. Let's say you have some money, you have solid savings, you're in retirement, you're comfortable. What would it look like, 10, 15 years down the road if those expenses begin to balloon? Now, one thing I will take advantage of this opportunity and say this. Over the past 10 to 20 years, the retirement communities really improved. I no longer refer to them as nursing facilities because I go to many, I present at many of those places. They're beautiful. They're not cheap. You have to be very careful, but we're talking about, different type of community versus, 20, 30 years ago when people go there to, people go there to live now.
I just visited one, and I won't say the name because we're not advertising them, but I just walked into one on Sunday, and there was a climbing wall in the lobby. And I walked in, I thought, who's using a climbing wall in this community? And I was corrected that there are plenty of people that have a regimen for doing that at 70. I'm thinking, ooh. So yeah, very different from wheelchairs and
Absolutely, and that's not without getting too much into the weeds, but that's one of the reasons why people want to have a plan, is to make sure they assess if or perhaps when there's a need for that type of transition, that they're prepared for it.
So because viewers are of all ages, and we addressed some early on about age, but I wanted to go just a little step deeper.
Sure. Take
us through our lives and financially what we should be doing. Again, second half, Alex is not giving financial advice.
Absolutely.
He's just sharing his experiences. I like to make sure that's on.
I appreciate it.
That's on tape, which ages me. So I'm in my 20s. I am about to go get my first job. what are the things I should be doing financially, and then move on up 30s, 40s, 50s, a little bit deeper.
Absolutely. So for those in their 20s, keep it basic. Start saving, make sure you have a budget. I wouldn't really worry about much else. Make sure you start saving. As I mentioned earlier, it can be as little as $25 a month. Hopefully it's more than that, depending on your expenses, depending on your income, but start saving and have a budget. Once you reach your 30s, and hopefully at that stage in your life, your income begins to gradually increase, this is a perfect time to have a full understanding, or at least, basic understanding of how investments work. What are mutual funds? Basic understanding, you don't have to go in detail. What are index funds? What is the difference between a 401k and a traditional IRA? You don't need to become an expert. You can, of course, always reach out for professional help, but you need to have that understanding. In your 40s, in this ideal world, you really want to be on track, meaning you're maximizing your contributions, IRA, 401k. I'm working the assumption, especially if you want to be particularly successful, in terms of working with your debt, such as credit cards, mortgages, hopefully on your track to pay it off. In your 50s, again, you're talking to someone who focuses on retirement planning, it's a perfect time to start thinking about, the next chapter.
Okay.
Perhaps it's going to happen 15, 20 years down the road, or 25, or you'll never retire, which perhaps we'll talk about because that's one of the trends. But you need to start thinking about. Now, 60s and beyond, that's when people usually reach out to me, it's all about the transition. Exactly how will you transition? When will you start collecting your Social Security benefits? How does Medicare work? How does it work with your employer plan? Once you actually retire, how are you going to draw from your accounts? You need to have a very good understanding of that. That is when a lot of people make crucial mistakes. Usually we're dealing with, larger sums of money, and some of those decisions are irrevocable or very difficult to change. Okay. And I will say this, I hope it's not going to be news to anyone who's listening. The mistakes you make in your 20s or 30s, you cannot compare that to the potential mistakes in your 50s, 60s, and beyond. Talking about your finances, of course.
True.
So.
And let's see, will we stop at 60s, 70s?
Well, and beyond. Usually when you're 70 plus or 80 plus, again, there's a lot of people who continue to work, but usually you already have a solid financial plan in place. Hopefully you're not working on developing one at that stage in your life, even though there's nothing wrong with that. If some people just decided to do it then. Later, of course, the idea, how exactly would you be transitioning or transferring your wealth to the next generation? That's true. Usually 70s, 80s, 90s, that's when people focus on that. But again, it's usually part of someone's comprehensive financial plan that they already have in place at that time.
Does anything change in your advice, in your counsel for self-employed who don't, I'm thinking, I have my own business, and retirement, what's that?
Oh, wow.
Plus the income is uncertain.
Yeah, I refer to it as lumpy. That's the term I tend to use for my self-employed clients or, small business owners. So I'll say two things. The cash flow piece, you have to be really on top of your cash flow. As a business owner, that's a good idea to begin with, but since that's your primary source of income, that's doubly important. The second piece is, in terms of retirement planning, you actually have many more options, which is what many people are not aware of. So I'll just make some examples. IRA, anyone can contribute. Solo 401k, SEP IRA. For those who make significant income, they can create the so-called cash balance plans, where they can, shelter hundreds of thousands on a pre-tax basis to really catch up on retirement. And if you want, we can develop on that, but there are strategies for self-employed specifically who undersaved earlier in their lives. Yeah. So you can really catch up compared to someone who's, let's say, a W-2 employee. You actually don't have those options.
Okay. And I'm thinking a lot of times, too, in my head, instead of saving, I say, okay, I want to invest this back in the business. And so I haven't built up the savings, that to when I'm ready to actually ease out of the business and take advantage of retirement. And I chuckled earlier when you said something about the spending in the 60s, 70s that they're probably staying around more. And I'm thinking, I just read about a year-long cruise that one of these cruise companies is offering. And I'm thinking, who can take a year-long cruise other than a retiree?
Well, that's probably the majority of their clients, let's put it that way.
So when people contact you, what do you do to get started working with them?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that it's very easy to get started. It truly is. If someone wants to reach out, we can always have a Zoom meeting, and I have a calendar on my website. And I don't think of these meetings as introductory meetings. I go beyond that. I call them strategy meetings. I leave it up to my, potential clients in this case, and if they're willing to share more beyond, their basic goals and objectives and asking me some questions, we'll actually have a productive time. Of course, I cannot provide any investment or financial advice up until we're fully engaged, and I say that up front, but at the very least, I'll list what options are available to them. Interesting, you mentioned self-employed people. I mean, that's one of the reasons people reach out to me. They're not even aware of what options are out there, and I'm more than happy to have that conversation, free of charge, actually. So,
do you work with other financial planners? Because a lot of people already have relationships built, but that financial planner may not focus on retirement per se. So you work with other financial planners, and what other kinds of folks do you partner with or work with? Is it movers, tax people, the people that help aid folks, seniors downsize? So I'm asking because as viewers are watching, they're like, okay, I can either recommend or I need to talk to him while I'm talking to the people I already have a relationship with.
So again, two questions, and I'll address the first one briefly, and actually the second one is really a great question. I do have several clients that, they work with other investment advisors. In some cases, these are actually their family members or close friends. So in some sense, they want to retain those relationships, which I absolutely respect, for the past 20 or 30 years, and those people did a pretty good job for them. It's just that they're not sure if they have the skills and experience to essentially help them transition into the next chapter of their life. So that's why they reach out to me. The second question, again, as part of building Capital Squared, I have a great ecosystem of people who can support my clients. CPAs, estate planning attorneys that focus on elder law, places essentially that can help you age at home, right? There's a variety of different companies that can help you with that. So there's an ecosystem. So when someone works with Capital Squared, well, the idea, of course, is to address most questions in-house, but we do want to connect with other people too.
Awesome. Alex, my God, I can't believe we're running out of time. And I mean, there's just so much information that we don't think about when we think about retirement. Your contact info is on the screen, and you've got the website. Thank you so much for being a guest on Think About It. And I don't know, one last 15-second set of message you want to leave.
Everyone needs to have a plan. A good plan can fit on a single sheet of paper, but everyone needs to have one. I'm biased, I'm a financial planner, but I truly believe in that. Thank you, Sylvia.
Excellent. And with that, we have come to the close. We're retiring the program on retirement. And so, as usual, I invite you to tune in, take what you see and hear, and think about it. Until the next show, I'm Sylvia Henderson.